This is an interview with Ferris Clay Bailey for the Nashville Bar Association History Project. Mr. Bailey, thank you so much for allowing us to do this interview. Let's set the stage for our listeners.
All right.
You grew up in Nashville, correct? And
That's
your
right.
father was a lawyer.
That's right.
And anything about Nashville and the days of your growing up, schools, associations, that you'd like to just start by sort of laying the landscape for us?
Well, the landscape is a good way to start because it was certainly different. Nashville was a small town in the sense that everyone knew everyone else, and the areas around it were much more rural. There was no Cool Springs. Franklin was a small town, and there was so much open space in Nashville itself that I know where I lived, we were surrounded by 200 or 300 acres of undeveloped land. That land is now Hillwood and Westmead, and you were able to ride ponies all over the place. Now it would be a traffic hazard somewhat. And at the time, for instance, I witnessed the building of the Belmead Theater, but there were other indications of Nashville's much more rural nature. That was in the school system. And at the time, you could ride your bicycle to school. I went to Parma School and then to MBA. And your parents felt safe enough that you were safe enough just getting on a bike and going to school.
Amazing.
They would be horrified today. Mm-hmm. But those things all began to change after the war. I know we had, I remember in particular, we had very little mechanization because I had to cut the grass. And we had coal as the source of heat, which made Nashville a place of soot and fog induced by coal dust. And that was one of the big changes we had when Nashville went to gas, was it cleaned up.
Your father was a lawyer. Was it common for you to, as a young boy, to go to his office? I mean, were you around lots of other lawyers?
No, it was not quite that rural. Of course, we had streetcars, and I'd ride the streetcar to town sometimes and go to his office, which was not air conditioned. But no, I was, as a pre-teenager and a teenager, I did not go downtown and witness courtroom dramas, right, as sometimes the movie indicates for small towns. We weren't that small.
But eventually you decided or went to law school.
I went in the Navy straight out of high school for about 13 months, and then went to college at Sewanee. And of course, I hadn't given much thought of what to do. So as I think many people go into law, it seemed natural if your father was a lawyer that that's what you do. So that's what I did. And went to Vanderbilt. Many lawyers back then would go to undergraduate school for 3 years, and then the fourth year would be at law school. I went 4 years.
You were talking about the rural nature of Nashville when you were growing up, but certainly being at Sewanee during that time, I mean, now there are storefronts and things outside the assembly grounds of the campus. But what was it like when you were there in undergraduate school?
Well, at that time, most of the students had been in the Army or Navy, and they were people who had probably left school at 19 or 20, having finished a freshman year and come back 4 years later. Some married, and so you had a much more mature environment as to student life, and of course it was, for many of them, it was a serious education. That is, during the week. On the weekend, their maturity as far as drinking exhibited itself, and I, being at the time the grandson of a very strict Methodist grandmother, learned from afar the lack of inhibitions that occur on those occasions. I did not partake. I witnessed. I was scared of my grandmother's reaction, but anyway.
You may have been the first designated driver long before the term was ever used.
Well, very few there weren't too many cars, but a lot of those older students were married, and of course their wives kept them in tow, but it was a wonderful experience, and it's influenced me the rest of my life. The academic work mixed in with the everyday life, you remained interested, and you were up there all alone.
And then you went to Vanderbilt Law School. What's your memory of being in law school? Was it arduous? Was it challenging?
It was a different way of learning, and also Vanderbilt was, by today's terms, quite antiquated. The library had a heating system that sounded like you were in the middle of an industrial plant, the clanking constantly going on, and then of course it was in McTeer Hall, and the library was, of course, by today's standards, was rather antiquated. You had to pull the books down and search, but as I say, the students there were more mature, just as in undergraduate, and we studied hard, and I remember in particular Eddie Morgan, who had come down to Nashville from Harvard, where he had been a preeminent evidence scholar, and he had reached retirement age and chose to continue teaching by coming to Vanderbilt. He was hard-nosed, and we had a blizzard, the great blizzard of '51, and we had the evidence exam on that day, and he trudged through the snow as a man in his mid-70s to give the exam. And so I managed to get there with about half of the class, and he at least we got a good made a good impression on him as far as his grading went. That was, I think, the most memorable thing during the first year was the blizzard, the greatest blizzard we've ever had. And but the professors were all they were older too, and they all had characteristics that we followed through the years, with stories being told about them. Even after we got out of law school, but it was a different way of learning. You had to learn to take both sides of an issue as far as the litigation courses went.
When you graduated from law school, did you immediately join the firm where your father was?
I did.
And who else was in the firm?
Well, let's see, Fred Powell and Andrew Ewing, and later Mr. Jim Dale. This is aside from my father. And firms was quite small then. The largest firm would probably have 12 or 13, 14 people.
So the lawyers had to be more general
The practice was much more generalized than it is today. You covered just about everything. Although you tended to separate criminal lawyers, were usually set apart. That was a broad specialty, and then but most people, their practice was centered around representing a family in a general way. If they had an accident, you represented them in that litigation, or if they had wills or you had businesses, you tended to cover their needs in a general way.
I think you had mentioned to me that as a very new lawyer, you tended to get I think you called them the nuisance cases, meaning not the tort nuisance cases, but the cases that the others were willing to let you handle.
Oh yes, that was, I had a case that, well, anyway, it was, one involved a malpractice case that was out of at Tennessee, what is now Tennessee State. A band member was fainted, and he was taken into the infirmary and to see what caused him to faint. And he was suddenly called into the operating room, and he was so scared he couldn't talk, and I don't know how this goes over in the interview, but he was circumcised by mistake. And his family wanted
I think that was very delicate, Mr. Bailey.
That was my first idea of what a malpractice case was, and that eventually that case was settled out of court. Thank heavens, because I knew absolutely nothing about what to do. That was a specialty I'd not ever expected to take part in. So then they had other things where young lawyers were appointed to defend criminal offenders, defendants who could not afford a lawyer. They had no.
Would the judges just appoint you from the bench?
Sitting there, and they just see you there, and they would appoint you. And
you had a very interesting case that you were appointed to. Why don't you tell us that?
One was I was sitting there, and the judge said, they brought some defendant in who had murdered his wife, and he appointed me to defend him. So in my innocence, I went over and asked the man, what he had done, and he turned out he was a painter, a dipsomaniac painter, who had hit his wife over the head with an iron skillet. She was not exactly a member of the WCTU herself. So he had been drunk when it happened, and anyway, I asked him about it, and I asked him how he'd been treated, and he started crying, and he said that the other prisoners were throwing lit strings on him. So to me, that seemed like he was insane, so I pled insanity, and we went to court, and there was a jury, and so they had the state doctor there saying he wasn't insane, and I just asked him what the prisoners did to him before, and he went through this saying they threw lit strings on him, and he broke down crying, and the jury saw that, and they said he's insane, so declared him insane. And I went back to the jailer to get his things, and he asked what happened to the old man, and I said, well, they said he was insane. When they learned he thought they were throwing lit strings on him, and he said, well, they were throwing lit strings on him. So
your brilliant defense was by mistake.
Yes, but anyway, he ended up out at the Central State painting the building. So I guess society benefited.
The society certainly did. Maybe I misheard you. Did you say there was another case that came to mind that you
there
were
was another
pointing to?
case where a fairly young fellow from Kansas, farm boy, had been involved. He was transporting prostitutes across state lines into Tennessee, and he stopped to rob a filling station and got in a shootout with an elderly attendant at the station, and the attendant, he shot the attendant, and the attendant had shot him too. So I had to go up and interview him, and he was lying up in the prison hospital bed reading Black Beauty, which I thought was rather odd for a criminal of that sort, but that's what he was doing, and he didn't have much of a defense. The prostitutes he was carrying, his car turned state evidence, and so I had met with his family and advised them that he had the choice of going to trial and maybe getting a death sentence or settling for life imprisonment. That was the DA at the time was Judge Loza's father, and so that was the deal we worked out. And 20 or 30 years later, he brought this action trying to get out of prison, saying he had inadequate representation. So there I was, brought back, had to go back over and testify about it. But he was unsuccessful in that. So anyway, I just about ended my criminal career.
And you were probably rather happy for it.
And I was quite happy.
And now, early on in your legal career, you were approached about running for the state legislature. What year was that?
That would have been the late 50s, 58.
And was it the mayor who approached you?
Well, it was
a
group of people interested in getting legislation passed to permit the metropolitan form of government in Nashville. It had come up for a vote earlier and it failed, and they had a new approach and had drafted a new bill to cover it, allow it with certain provisions we thought would be more acceptable. And so the powers that be wanted a slate of candidates pledged to support that legislation. I think Woody Sims and Garner Robinson and some others wanted, Bob Taylor, and Tom Shriver, and some others, Pat Doyle, I think, was one. But it was so back at that time, you had to run in the whole county. There were no legislative districts. A county, say, had 7 representatives, and the top 7 in the vote of the county would be the representatives.
So you had to go and try to get votes
Yes.
all around the county?
All around the county. I lived on Hillwood and went to DuPont and Old Hickory and every place. And it was attending all of those, the events they would have, fairs and whatnot, was sort of a gastric torture. And so anyway, it was a great learning experience, though, and so we got our slate in and went. There were many other. We had to legislate, of course, on everything, but our primary goal was to get this bill through. It was a general act with local application of what, and we had, everybody on this, in our group, our delegation was pledged to support that legislation. There was one turncoat. Of course, what it was, the mayor of Nashville, Ben West, was opposed to it, and the county judge, Briley, was for it. And so those were the forces, that was the layout, that's who was pushing it, who was opposing it. And the legislature, the whole legislature, had a tradition of never passing a general bill with local application unless the entire delegation supported it. In other words, each member had a veto power in effect. And we knew at the last that this one person was a turncoat.
Now, he was not a lawyer, was he?
He was not a lawyer. I think there were only 4 lawyers on the delegation. And so but we had lined up enough legislators to break the custom. They were scared that Ben West would start annexing property outside of the county, which could be done. A big city could annex, for instance, Nashville could go into Williamson County and annex. And that frightened the legislators. And also something that helped us was that on the day of the vote, when we had to get the entire legislature to vote on it, the turncoat had a problem. He had a pet monkey that had bitten him on his thumbs, and he got blood poison, and that prevented his attendance at the event. And we really thought that some recognition should be given to the monkey.
I'm surprised that you didn't take it to a taxidermist and had it stuffed for the Metro Courthouse.
Yes, and there were other events in the legislature that indicated the times we were in. It was the time when many people thought that communist spies were lurking in Tennessee. they,
And this was during the National McCarthy
yes, this was
period.
right after that. And
Okay.
they shut down the Highlander Folk School. And there was one in particular individual, Representative Harry Lee Center from Kingsport, was proposing that all lawyers' offices could be opened up, and investigated for associating with communists or something. He wanted the TBI to investigate lawyers, and that bill was up for a vote, and nobody knew. If you voted against it, you'd be considered a communist probably or something, sympathizer. So one particular legislator saw the danger and how to head it off, and his name was Stump Daddy Graham from Jasper, Tennessee, and he got up and proposed that he first said that Senator Harry Lee Center was a great patriot, and that we ought to recognize his patriotism. And in keeping with that, he proposed that we appropriate $500 to have a statue of Harry Lee sculpted, and that statue be placed beneath Andrew Jackson's horse's tail. And it passed, and that caused an uproar, and everything broke down, and they adjourned the thing, and so that's how the bill was gotten rid of. But these things don't seem to take place much now. We have enough nuts in the legislature as it is. So, but anyway.
You mentioned the Highlander School, and for people who were involved on both sides of that issue, it was a very, very controversial. People were very passionate about it. Tell us about the vote that occurred on that, and your vote in that.
Well, it was up around Sewanee, and it was quite liberal. The CIO had something to do with it, and it was, and also that had integrated, black and white, and they were showing pictures of black men and white women dancing the Highland Reel or something like that. Well, passed around the legislature. But Mrs. Hugh Morgan, whose husband, Dr. Morgan, had been head of medicine, the general and head of medicine in the Second World War for the U.S. Army, and was a longtime professor at Vanderbilt Med School. Well, anyway, he and his wife were close friends, family friends, and she made me promise to vote against it, and I did, against closing it down, and I was the lone vote, but of course I was more afraid of Mrs. Morgan than I was of the legislature.
Well, did you get comments, phone calls, letters as a result of your vote?
It turned out nobody cared, It had no negative effect.
But the legislature did revoke the charter.
They revoked
of the
the charter.
Okay.
Yeah. And then it moved to Knoxville, somewhere around Knoxville in East Tennessee.
You served more than one term in the legislature?
Yes, the second term, there was another problem that needed to be addressed with the firemen and police union, and it had to do with a pension. It was a sort of a technical thing, but it was going to break the Metro government's treasury, and we didn't do something about it by some mistake, intentional or not, I don't know, but the pension plan said that fire and police could retire at age 65 or after having had 25 years or 20 years service, which meant that they were retiring at 50 years old. So many of them went on the force, they were right out of high school.
Sure.
So it was intended that they could retire at a certain age, not after. So when you had 45 and 50-year-old people retiring,
got expensive.
it would break the pension. So we had to change it to and. And that had all the fire and police lurking around, and we had to hold the session of the legislature over. They do it artificially by just turning the clock back. And we sat up there until midnight until the members of the delegation supporting the police gave in. And then I decided I'd had my fill of legislative life, and so I chose not to become a regular politician. Young lawyers served in the legislature as sort of a civic duty and then put it aside. Mm-hmm. So that's what I did.
At some point, though, following that, you were selected to be a delegate to the Constitutional Convention that Tennessee called for after the decision of Baker versus Carr, which we celebrate this year. It's 50th year. Tell us about the convention delegates and attending the convention.
Of course, prior to Baker versus Carr, the legislative representation had been weighted mostly in favor of rural legislators because there had been no reapportionment for 50 years. So the growth of the cities during that period, growth of urban areas, had been grossly underrepresented. In other words, they'd use the vote. Say Moore County had had more representation than the city of Nashville. Proportionally, Nashville would have a representative for say 80,000, one for 80,000 people if you divided it out, and Moore County would have 10 times more representation. But anyway, so they had to divide the state up, and the state wanted to, so the rural legislators were still in control, so they divided the urban areas up into districts where we had run for the legislature on the whole county. We represented the whole county and city, not just a sliver of it, a district. Mm-hmm. But they cut it up in the new Constitution. And so that's, we fought that because we thought that the representatives ought to represent the entire county, not, for instance, Belmead or Woodbine or whatever. I mean, that's in effect what happened. And so, but that was unsuccessful, and that eventually led to the reapportionment system we have now, where the party in control drafts legislation creating districts that meander around the state that's illogical from every perspective except trying to have a representative put in place from one party in perpetuity.
That's true.
In perpetuity, that's.
Mm-hmm. One
So
could
anyway,
say we've
that-
seen that at work recently for certain.
Yes.
When we talked first, you mentioned that a couple of the other delegates that you worked with, Tom Steele was one of them, and a woman who was really quite an activist, a woman named Molly Todd.
Molly Todd had been a women's rights spokeswoman for many years, and she was elected as a delegate, and I think was brave. It's a time when there was not much support for her positions on women's rights in a male-dominated political body such as we had, and she stood up, I thought, courageously for these views, and she was ridiculed and whatnot. She happens to be the mother of Robert Massey, the author of some prominence. As I think Catherine the Great is his current book.
That's right.
But he was raised in Nashville. His father had died, and his mother had remarried someone named Todd. So anyway, that was...
During this period, you mentioned the conflicts between rural and urban legislators. Were there labor considerations?
Yes, the labor, the rural delegates, the rural legislators thought, and rural delegates to the convention, thought that labor dominated urban areas, and that they would impose, if, in other words, if you had a unified county election system, in other words, you ran it in the whole county, that the labor vote would count more, and there would be more labor-oriented legislators. So that was their theory. It was that fear. And I guess a lot of business interests were opposed to labor. Well, at least the rural people thought that that was the case.
Sure. So that was that was a fairly distinguished career in public service, but you were...
I was ready to get back. I had a growing family to support.
And so you rejoined the firm.
And what?
You rejoined your law firm.
Yes, and I was always at the law firm. I was having to do that and do the other.
Oh, that's right.
The legislative work. Back then, it was, nobody considered being in the legislature to be a career as they do now.
Were you even paid per diem?
You're
back
paid
then?
something like $5 or $10 traveling expense, and we, it was, you certainly were not in it for the pay. The pay is, now you got to pay, everybody has their own office. Nobody had an office. All we had was some rooms at the Hermitage Hotel that we could sort of caucus in, and the county paid for that, not the state.
When you devoted yourself again to the practice of law, you had some colorful clients, and you told me about one of them.
Well, you have all sorts of clients, and having the general sort of practice that was prevalent then. I'll just mention some. I mean, there are a lot of regular clients, so you could talk about whatever you did for them. It would not be very memorable. It would just be routine. But some people were not routine people. Some clients weren't. And I'll always remember Mr. Raymond Ligon, who was the owner of Woodlawn Cemetery way back. He bought it during the war, and he had great visions, and he was somewhat of a far-sighted entrepreneur. And during the war, Woodlawn was on two sides of Thompson Lane. One was the old cemetery, and then they'd acquired an area across, I guess, to the north side of Thompson Lane. And there was a Army facility across where Sidco used to be, or is. That was a classification center. And they needed food, beef, so he turned the part of Woodlawn, which was not being used for burials, into a pig farm, which was to serve the classification. He got the pork contract for the classification center by using this cemetery as the vacant cemetery land. And I thought that was rather enterprising, but there came a time when the pigs had to go and the classification center went. And so he then developed the cemetery, and he decided to, the next thing he thought he might do was have the world's tallest mausoleum. And so he put out plans, and he was on the Tonight Show publicizing with these plans for this mausoleum. And he didn't know what to call it, and he took everything you said seriously, and I had not fully appreciated that, because they asked me what to name it, and I suggested The Holiday Out, but he almost did it, and I had to persuade him, no, that's not a good idea. And
did he attribute that to you on The Tonight Show?
oh, no, he didn't. That was after The Tonight Show, thank heavens. I may have been accused of malpractice or something for defaming the use of burials or something. But then he had emergencies, and one time he was on the part of the cemetery still that wasn't being used. He had raised cattle, and once the fence broke down and the cattle got loose in the cemetery, and they don't mix well. And so in the middle of the night, he calls Nash what to do. And I didn't have any idea what to do. I suggested getting some cowboys, but that was, so he did, he eventually got them rounded up, but he was just constantly getting embroiled. The next thing he did, and this caused a big fight, was to propose and actually carry through on having a funeral home right in the middle of the cemetery to eliminate the transportation of the line and whatnot. And so that caused a big fight in the legislature. The funeral home people wanted to have a law prohibiting having a funeral home in a cemetery, although it certainly seemed logical. And so that was a big political fight, and but we got that through. So now you can, out at Woodlawn, they have a funeral home.
Right.
And I guess in other places they do too. And so
well, I must admit, I'm quite impressed that you were able to get that through. I would imagine the funeral home had very significant constituents.
I never want to it was a very stressful representation. He was, he eventually, lost. He got in bad health and eventually died. And his one son took it over, but couldn't run it. And it was sold. So I think, as usual, someone in Texas owns it.
Of course.
So,
you traveled with him to some of the conventions
yes, I
or
went
association
to a
meetings?
convention. He insisted that I go out to Kansas City to there's going to be a presentation of something called the Gold Cross Plan Number 2. I didn't know what Gold Cross Plan Number 1 was. And it was, anyway, driving out there, he was a sort of a fearless driver, much more so than I ever thought about being. And so there were several near accidents from his driving at high speeds in his Cadillac. And I made the excuse that I had to be back early, and the first thing I did in Kansas City was call the airline. And after attending the Gold Cross Plan, which was put on by some charlatan with a head of peroxided hair, so I advised against having anything to do with it. So anyway, I did get back and sought out the dullest law practice I could find for a while.
I think you told me that that your firm represented, was it Southern Railway?
Southern Railway.
Now, did they have offices here?
No, the reason for representation here was that the state capitol was here and the agencies. And but that back then it was always a dispute between the truckers and the railroads about the weight of the trucks, what they could carry, and having tandem trailers and length, and of course the railroads were opposed, and then there were other things like liability for cows that got hit on the railroad track where there was no fence, free ranging, and so that lobbying was pretty interesting. And I had occasion also to do something about, for my old alma mater at Sewanee, the beer boards in the rural counties were usually controlled by hard-shell Baptists, and they didn't want to grant a beer license to anybody. And and so that was causing a problem for Sewanee. They didn't want the boys driving off the mountain. They'd rather have it under control. Mm-hmm. And so, but they wouldn't grant a beer license. That is, Franklin County wouldn't. So there was a law passed we had that said that you could appeal from the beer board de novo to the circuit court. Well, they didn't know what de novo meant, and it's just, we just said it's just a matter of ordinary review. It's done everywhere, and so said de novo means just, it's just a technical term. And so it passed, and so it enabled the University of the South to keep its students more locally confined when they, on the weekends.
in the interest of public safety,
Yes.
don't you know? When you were representing the railway, there was an occasion where you and your wife, Joanne, went to, was it a convention in New Orleans?
Yes, yes, Joanne and I went down to the convention of the Southern Railway Lawyers, and they were from all over the South, and we were ushered into this room, our quarters, and they were palatial. They looked out over the Mississippi River, and they had flowers all over the place, and a suite, of rooms. And I thought, this is really good treatment for just a young lawyer and his wife from Tennessee. Wonderful. And so we'd unpacked and got everything done. There was a knock on the door, and it was the president of the railroad and his entourage. They'd given us the wrong room. We actually had the president's room. So we were evicted to less glamorous quarters. But still, it was good to meet with all these lawyers. And
Your father had represented Mr. H.G. Hill.
oh,
and,
yes.
And you continued that relationship.
Well, yes, along with a lot of other lawyers.
Right.
Yeah, he was a neighbor. We had the house my parents had built was the first house ever built in Hillwood. And the lot where we built, the corner of Post Road in Hillwood, was a legal fee to my father from Mr. Hill. That's how I was raised on what was virtually a farm.
Mm-hmm. At some point, Mayor Briley, even though you were fully dedicated to practicing law and glad to be out of the political life of the legislature, you were appointed to a metropolitan commission. And
It was a civil service commission. And that was, that had to do with all fire and police and all metro employees, what raises and disciplinary
You
matters.
served on there for several terms.
Some.
Were there a lot of changes during that period?
There was changes because of the growth of the metropolitan government and whatnot, but it was a good experience. I thought that the advantage of being on there, I'd noticed some provision that if you were on the commission, you couldn't make contributions to political campaigns, and that was a real plum, I thought. But anyway, the politicians found some way around it, so my logic broke down gradually. But I was there for that supposed reason for about 25 or 30 years, and I was finally chairman, and
that's a long service.
And it was a long time.
But it's to your credit. I noticed that in addition to serving on that commission for several terms, a long period of years, you taught at the Nashville School of Law. I guess it was the Y Law School when you started.
Right.
For, 25 or 30 years?
30 years.
And you taught what subject?
Constitutional law, and I've got to...
Go ahead.
Oh.
And you go ahead and eat. That law school has certainly served an important... You can.
They'll think I'm trying.
We were talking about your teaching at what is now the Nashville School of Law. And did you become familiar with your students? Do you remember any of your students particularly? Because a lot of those students have gone on to serve as judges.
Oh yes,
Many public officials in Nashville.
some of Judge Barbara Haynes and Senator Joe Haynes and Muriel Robinson, a judge, and I think Irvin Gilcrease was,
Yes.
and various ones, and of course a number never practiced law. But I'm always seeing somebody on the street, and they remember me, and then they have to explain. Over that many years, I can't remember everyone. The classes were fairly large.
At some point, the legal community in Nashville began to change. Firms became larger.
Yes.
More people were coming in here for a variety of reasons. And your firm
It grew.
grew.
It this was a period of both gradual and rapid change. Firms began to specialize, and you had the billing rate was by the hour. Billable hours became the great mantra of law practice. And I guess the specialization reflected the government regulation and legislation that had come about. Like we had the growth of medical facilities here, privatized, like HCA. So you had that was a specialty that grew up dealing with getting hospital permits. Then you had the complications of tax law, state taxes and whatnot. So that's another specialty, wills and estates. And of course, there were others, white collar crime. And of course, real estate was booming around here. A lot of this growth in specialization resulted from the growth of Nashville itself, rather than being the world's largest small town. It became a very diverse metropolitan area, and also along with that were the technical advances, like the computers. Nobody sat and typed and used carbon paper anymore like they used to. I don't know how we survived doing that. If you made a mistake, you had to go back and do it over. But those things came about so fast, like the fax machine and sending something off. 30 years ago, you couldn't do any of that. And so nowadays, lawyers don't dictate anymore. They sit there and type with their computers. Of course, I did not do that. I had remained a dogged Luddite, if you know what that is. But I appreciated my secretary doing it. And so I retired without ever having mastered a computer. However, I have now as a way of communicating with others. But the practice of law has caused some of the more pleasant aspects of the practice to disappear. That would be the camaraderie of going down to a place such as we had called the bullpen, where lawyers would go from all sorts of backgrounds and tell war stories or communicate with each other, even though they were on opposite sides.
Was that an actual place?
Oh yes, it was on Union Street. that was the coffee gathering spot where where great stories were told of, probably lacking in veracity, but anyway, that sort of association among lawyers has disappeared, I think, for the most part. Especially with the large firms, they just stayed to themselves, and there's, of course, you do have the single general practitioner and the small boutique firms, but it's and I think the billable hours has caused distortion, and I think that's coming back to hurt lawyers because the client sees, when you talk to the client, will be scared to talk to you. All he sees is, okay, for 15 minutes, that's X dollars. And so, but I think that will change and go back eventually to the more or less by what you did, as a value.
The firm, Mr. Ewing in your firm,
Yes.
joined with a fellow who moved to Nashville from the East, Bill Dearborn.
Bill Dearborn. That was Dearborn and Ewing was the firm that we had started, and Bill Dearborn had connections in Nashville. His uncle lived here, and so he was an up east type, but a very gentle person. And Mr. Ewing had been in our firm. He was a man of the old school, had some sort of Latin quote for every situation, and none of which we understood. And he was sort of a character. It's something you might be familiar with. He chewed a cigar.
I am familiar with that.
And it was customary. We all worked on Saturdays back then. And the new secretary would be told that she would work on Saturday. One of her duties was to empty Mr. Ewing's spittoon. But that was, we had to tell her it was a joke before she quit. But anyway, those things have changed. I think many lawyers are, they maybe they go to law school with the idea of being one thing, and it's in sort of like medicine. We need a generalization, somebody who can spot all the problems and then refer the client to the particular specialty that's needed, rather than the client hopping around between one and the other. But it's, and I think lawyers do a lot of public service too. I think that tradition has kept going.
And some still go into the office on Saturdays.
I know some some still go, but the whole firm doesn't go.
That's correct, yeah.
And I retired a number of years ago, and I can't say that I haven't enjoyed it. My wife had been a big help during all of the legislative times in entertaining the rural folk and in getting me elected, because we'd have to go to these various boxes and hand out cards, and she always got more votes than anybody. It would just so happen that she was pregnant at the time. And using that as a political weapon, whatever it was.
Well, it worked.
It worked, and but I just couldn't keep on having children. So,
Now we know why you got out of the legislature. Mr. Bailey, you have delighted us with this interview. I want to give you an opportunity to finish up or add anything that I may have failed to ask you. But I just want to say, thank you for giving your time and attention to this project for the Nashville Bar. You are a fine subject.
Well, I've enjoyed the years in the practice, and I just hope other young lawyers can do the same.
Thank you.